Hey, podcast listeners. Today's episode is called Hate is a Vacuum. So, hate is a vacuum. And Western culture, we have a lot of hangups about the word hatred and the feeling of hatred and being honest about our feelings of hatred. I want to unpack the truth about this very misunderstood emotion because, like all other emotions, it is there for a reason to give us wisdom. There are no right or wrong feelings, no good or bad feelings. Feelings should not be judged because they are involuntary. We can judge our actions, but why would we judge emotions? One myth about hatred is that it leads to violence. But hatred isn't like anger. Anger is passionate. Hatred, I have found to be very cold and not passionate at all. Hatred is actually best defined by what it is not, because it is more of a lack than actual substance. Specifically, hatred is a lack of active love. For instance, a mother may feel love for her child, but if she fails to embody this love by listening to her child, believing him, showing empathy to him, then she is actively hating him. It doesn't matter that she feels love and warmth in her heart toward him, because that sentiment is not able to be experienced by him. Hatred is nothing more than a vacuum that should be filled with active love. Only the people we expect to love us can hate us like this. Only the people that we would call loved ones, partners, parents, and good friends can hate us to this degree because love is their job description. A lack of attunement from a loved one is never neutral. It can't be. We feel this in our gut, where we feel betrayal, shame, and disgust. When someone we love fails to attune to us, our body suffers. A few years ago, my friend Kathy came to visit out of town. While she was there, but she was in the other room, I said something really rude to my daughter, who was about 19 years old at that time. Edie caught me. She called me out. She held me accountable for what I said, and I apologized. The next morning, I relayed this experience to Kathy because she was a mom of kids around the same age, and I expected her to understand. I wanted to confess to her my own hideousness from that night before. I expected Kathy to say something to the effect of, I know, I can be a monster to my kids too. That's what I'd experienced from other mom friends as we humbly and honestly bare our souls to each other in support. That was what I needed to hear, because attunement is love. Love embodies empathy by relating to someone when they open up in their brutal honesty with us. But that is not what Kathy did. Instead of connecting with me by nodding knowingly, she gasped as if she couldn't understand or imagine being unkind. Instead of relating to my humanity, Kathy demonstrated an aversion to it, and I felt worse than before. There was no relatability, on understanding, or honesty. In its absence, I felt only cold judgment. Kathy's lack of attunement that day wasn't neutral. It was a betrayal. And in that moment, it added to my shame. Since then, I have realized that Kathy is in denial of her own humanity. And now, instead of shame, I feel disgust with Kathy. With friends like this, who needs enemies? Another example is my friend Mary. She happened to come over for lunch the day I had received a surprising, angry text from a client who I had unwittingly offended. The text was a tirade intended to be hurtful, making unfair accusations and conclusions in order to shame me. It was shocking to receive this. I read the text out loud to my friend, who I expected to resonate with my incredulity, showing validation and encouragement. Mary chose not to do this, but instead simply responded coldly. Well, did you learn from your mistake? I felt more alone in that moment than if Mary had not been present, and I wished she hadn't. Suffice it to say, Mary and Kathy are no longer my friends because now that I've learned to identify hate properly, I've resolved to live a hate-free life. Mary and Kathy have not changed, and their active hate was not new. What's new is my recognition of it and my commitment to protecting myself from haters at all costs. I have a smaller friend group now as a result, but it is filled with people who are able to be truly happy for me, who are consistent in their support and empathy. The third example I want to share with you today of active hatred is a bittersweet one, because even though my husband has hurt me more than any friend ever could, when he became fully aware of the effects, he repented and made significant change. Steve first withheld empathy from me when I was at my most vulnerable 17 years ago, while I was struggling with loneliness from a recent move. I looked at him with tears in my eyes, needing understanding and empathy, and my gaze was returned with a hardened gaze and his withholding of empathy, because he was defending against his own guilt for being the reason for our move. Turns out my body, without my conscious awareness, had experienced this exact same gaze previously when I was a little child seeking empathy from my mother. This experience with Steve activated old shame, causing me to start vomiting involuntarily at random times, such as while driving on the freeway or walking down the street. It was humiliating, to say the least. It also triggered profound feelings of loneliness and emptiness that created chronic hunger day and night and resulted in me gaining 30 pounds in 2 months. I became severely depressed and had elevated levels of cortisol and white blood cells, indicating the beginning of an autoimmune disorder. I now view high cortisol levels resulting from anger that is trapped inside our body. Research demonstrates autoimmune disorders are often the result of what is called alexithymia, a scientific word which basically means keeping it all inside. Even though my attachment figure betrayed me by withholding empathy from me when I was most vulnerable, I did not voice my anger. I talked myself out of it, trying to just move on. But as they say, the body keeps the score. The only thing that pulled me out of my nightmare at that time was to go back to school to become a therapist, taking back agency over my life. Yet because I had not yet identified the source of my illness as the lack of love from my husband, my newfound stability was fragile. The moment I once again needed Steve's attunement, which was still unavailable, I fell back into another depressive episode. This time I needed his support with a horrible therapy supervisor who demanded that I counsel a married couple when I was not remotely equipped to do so. I needed Steve to validate how unethical this was and to encourage me to stand my ground or to find another counseling center to work in. Instead, he did not try to understand my situation, but told me that I needed to respect my supervisor and follow orders, even though my internship was unpaid and at will. Now, I chose to listen to Steve and to betray myself, which was the ultimate factor in the catalyzation of that second depressive episode. And I alone am responsible for making that choice. But his vacuum of empathy created the ideal environment for that decision to be made. Things continued to go downhill at that counseling center, causing me to feel more alone and ashamed, betraying myself over and over. I ended up becoming so depressed that I could no longer work, and it ultimately culminated in a suicide attempt. This depressive episode lasted for years. When I finally confronted Steve, helping him see the role his lack of attunement played, he was able to believe me. It took him weeks to process this truth, including nights with no sleep. I gave him an ultimatum. Either he learns how to empathize and we stay married, or we say goodbye. Because in my purview, the purpose of marriage is to not feel alone, which was all I had ever felt. He took this seriously, listening to podcasts and using a feelings word list to get in touch with his own feelings and with his own childhood. He allowed me to do integration exercises on him, dislodging shame and helping him connect with little Steve. Attunement still doesn't come as naturally for him as it does with my female friends, but he is on a learning curve. And I do feel far more heard and understood, which is phenomenal. Unlike Kathy and Mary, Steve's active hatred wasn't based from jealousy, but ignorance. It wasn't an intentional withholding of empathy, but a lack of experience with it, based in his own childhood. Unlike my former friends, Steve desires to actively love me and just needs practical know-how. Not all active hate stems from felt hatred. Active love entails prioritizing another person's comfort above our own, and love is willing to learn. Love trumps hate because love has substance, while hatred is nothing more than a cold, empty void. Let's create lives where every void is filled with love. Love begets life and is worth protecting. When we become true to ourselves in this way, we flourish. And just like a flourishing tree creates habitat for thousands of creatures, including shade and fruit for humans, there is nothing selfish about our flourishing because it changes the whole world for the better. Physics tells us that nature hates a vacuum. Let's fill that emptiness with love. Thanks for listening today. Please share this with a friend and please subscribe to this podcast and give me a wonderful review. Thank you.